Yes, we do. For today's interview, we're going to focus on Syria, where there's been a huge shift where basically over U.S. protests, Arab states have readmitted Syria to the Arab League. And this is a major milestone as Syria tries to recover from a catastrophic, decade-long dirty war, and shows that the Middle East is not following U.S. orders because Saudi Arabia, a very, very close U.S. ally, is now turning to rapprochement, re-engagement with a government that it tried to overthrow. Saudi Arabia was very involved in the effort to regime change Syria. So this is a big milestone, and we're going to talk about that and many other issues affecting Syria, including crippling U.S. sanctions, with two guests. Hekmat Aboukhater, who is a Syrian-American journalist. He's just written a great article for The Gray Zone, which we'll link to. It's called Eviscerated, Humiliated, Yet Resilient: How Syrians Survive America's Economic Siege. And Hekmat went around Syria and just profiled ordinary Syrians trying to cope with the impact of crippling U.S.-led sanctions. And also joining us is Kevork Almassian. He is a political commentator who publishes videos at the website Syriana Analysis. So let's go to Hekmat and Kevork on Syria. Kevork and Hekmat, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you
very much.
Kevork, let me start with you. There's just been this dramatic scene where Assad flew in to the Arab League summit shortly after Syria was readmitted for the first time since the early stages of the Syria dirty war. There's this footage of Assad meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, MBS, and that's just very powerful because Saudi Arabia was a key part of this coalition led by the U.S. that tried to overthrow the Syrian government. So talk to us about the significance of Syria's return to the Arab League and Assad personally going to attend this summit.
Actually, there are three reasons why the Arab League readmitted Syria again to the organization, and this was an effort headed by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. First of all, the regime change war that started in 2011 up until, in my opinion, 2017, late 2017, has failed. Secondly, so they have to deal with Assad and Syria as a de facto, him as a de facto leader of Syria. They know that he's not going anywhere, and especially after Trump ended the regime change war in 2017 under the covert Operation Timber Sycamore. Secondly, the Saudis and the Emiratis, they have a different vision now in the region, which is mostly based on economic development. And it is now in their interest to stabilize the region because they have a vision for the future, which is Saudi Arabia has a vision 2030 for them, and they're preparing for the post-fuel era in the region. And the third reason is because the Americans are quite busy with the Ukraine war, and the Saudis and the Emiratis found alternative powers stepping in the region. And I'm specifically talking about Russia and China. China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, something that nobody saw coming. In my opinion, I was very surprised by this deal, and I think this will have its positive repercussions on the entire region. And also the Russian brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Syria. It was the Russians who were negotiating or mediating between Syria and Saudi Arabia since 2018. But this is very surreal, knowing that Saudi Arabia at least took charge of the Syrian file or the regime change war in Syria between 2013 and 2018. And in 2013, when Bandar bin Sultan came as the head of the Saudi intelligence, he asked the Arabic countries to allocate $2 trillion to remove Bashar al-Assad from power. I'm not sure that they were able to collect $2 trillion, but the estimates are way more than $200 billion. And if we compare the size of Syria to the size of Ukraine and how much the Americans spent in Ukraine nowadays, $170 billion. And if you compare that to Syria, which is a small size, a very small country compared to Ukraine, we know that hundreds of thousands of tons of weapons were dumped on the Syrian scene. And this has happened in cooperation between different regional countries. But there were two main military operational rooms, one in southern Turkey and one in northern Jordan. And all in all, the Saudis tried to assassinate Assad. And this was confessed by the former Qatari foreign minister, that they had a plan to assassinate Assad in 2013 when they tasked different so-called rebel groups in the suburbs of Damascus to shower Damascus with unguided rockets and missiles and create chaos, security chaos, and then attack on the presidential palace. So we know what could have happened if this was successful.
Just to be clear, this came out in a leak from Edward Snowden in the NSA files, where the NSA had picked up intelligence that Saudi Arabia literally said to its proxies in Syria, light up Damascus, including attacking the airport.
Yeah, and later the former foreign minister of Qatar, Hekmat bin Jassim, confessed this on TV, on a Qatari national TV, saying that this was the plan. And he was present during a meeting with Bandar bin Sultan, and this was planned. But then after MBS came to power, it seems there was some policy shift in regards to Syria, but mostly because the regime change war has failed. So they have to deal with Syria as a de facto presence in the region.
Who from Qatar admitted this? Sorry.
Hekmat bin Jassim, he was the former foreign minister of Qatar.
And why did he admit this?
Because there is disagreement between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and the Saudis were blaming Qatar for every turmoil that happened in the region. Yes, Qatar was the spearhead, I would say, for the Arab Spring, at least between 2011 and 2013. And when the Saudis started to blame Qatar publicly, he came out and said that we have all the evidence and we have all the recordings for this, so don't blame us alone. We worked all together in this, and we have the information, and I have the evidence, and I can show it when it's necessary.
So here's a compilation of several Western leaders very on message about Bashar al-Assad. Let's see what they had to say.
He must go.
Assad needs to go.
Assad must go.
Assad must go.
Assad must go.
We are still saying Assad has to go.
Assad has to go.
Assad has to go, and I'm confident that Assad will go.
Assad must ultimately go.
Our position on Assad has not changed, that he must go.
Assad must go.
And Assad must go.
Assad should go.
Assad will still have to go.
Assad is a war criminal and should go.
Assad is on his way out.
Bashar al-Assad is finished.
Our goal and focus remains an end to Assad's rule.
Well, what he wants to do about Assad? Take him out? Well, how are we going to do that?
By fighting Assad, who turned out to be a lot tougher than she thought. And now she's going to say, oh, he loves Assad.
The official explanation, of course, of why Assad must go, as John McCain said, is because he's a war criminal. What would you say the real, what do you say the opposition to Assad comes from? Why must he go?
Yeah, I think the main reason is the foreign policy of Syria. It's not the mistakes that Bashar al-Assad committed, and there are plenty during his reign, but the mistakes that he didn't commit, and especially when it comes to the Iraq war, the invasion of Lebanon and Libya. We have to remember that Syria supported the resistance in Iraq, and the American generals do not forget that they lost hundreds of officers and soldiers in Iraq because of the Syrian support. Syria supported Hezbollah, Hamas. Syria sent them sophisticated weaponry. It was the first time in 2006 that Israelis were surprised. They were caught in surprise in Lebanon that Hezbollah has anti-tank rockets. And then these weapons were delivered to Gaza. And the Hezbollah, they smuggled this weaponry through the tunnels in Egypt to the Gaza Strip. In 2008, Hamas and Islamic Jihad, they used this weaponry. And in this last war between Gaza and Israeli occupation forces, Islamic Jihad, they fired a few missiles on Tel Aviv. And those are Chinese technology, but they are made in Syria. So all in all, in the region, they wanted to take Assad out in order to remove the last Arabic government and an army that supports the armed resistance against the Israeli occupation forces. That's the main reason for it. It's not, the United States doesn't have a strategic interest in removing Assad or destroying Syria. It's about Israel, in my opinion. And Assad was negotiating or talking to the Israelis indirectly several times, but his position is clear. It's Israel has to withdraw to the 4th of June 1967 borders, and also allow the Palestinians to go back to their homes. That means all the settlements must be dismantled. And before that, Syria is not ready to strike a deal with Israel. I think that's the main reason, and that explains why when the war started in Syria and all of a sudden all these so-called NATO-backed rebel groups started attacking air defense bases in Syria. Why would rebel groups destroy air defenses in Syria? It's about Israel. And now we see that Syria is trying to repair its air defenses, and that's why Israel also striking all the time any attempt to improve the Syrian air defense systems.
Yeah, I completely agree with Kevork. Syria has been for the longest time the crown jewel of the resistance, the Levant, the crescent of resistance in the region. And the United States foreign policy has never had issues with war criminals, quote unquote. They were the allies of Saddam Hussein for 10 years. They are still the allies of the Saudi royal family. They're the allies of the Qatari royal families. So they've never had issues supporting, abetting war criminals, but this is a clear, one of those clear missions where they ultimately failed to push through their own foreign policy, and that's why they're vehemently now sanctioning the country and destroying it.
Yeah, and when Syria is accused of war crimes, what gets left out of that accusation is that all of these allegations come in violence that occurred inside Syrian territory because the Syrian government was defending itself against the most well-funded insurgency, arguably in history. So if you don't want Syria to commit atrocities, then don't funnel billions of dollars worth of weapons in their territory to arm fighters to overthrow the government. It's just pretty simple. That's going to happen. There's going to be violence when you're organizing a massive insurgency, and that totally gets left out of the conversation. Kevork, since you mentioned the issue of the Golan Heights, which Israel occupies, let's actually go to a clip of Trump, who was recently on his golf course, and he came across some Israelis or maybe just some Jewish voters, and he bragged to them that he gave the Golan Heights of Syria to Israel. Let's watch that clip.
Golan Heights. I gave you Golan Heights. I gave you Golan Heights. Remember that. Have a good time, brother.
I mean, this is electoral. He's just attracting Jewish voices, right? In the United States, it was this in the United States or in the Golan Heights? It's in the United States, right? So it's meant for internal message to gain votes in this regard, and it's very surreal, especially when we see now that the United States speaks about a foreign invasion of an independent country in Ukraine and capturing territories there that is illegal according to international law. When every single UN Security Council resolution says clearly that every inch of territory that Israel occupied after the 4th June of 1967 are null and void, and they don't have an authority over the Golan Heights. And unfortunately, the negotiations with Israel are very, very difficult because the approach of Hafez al-Assad was, we have to negotiate collectively with Israel. That means Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon and Syria. We all have borders with Israel. We have to negotiate as one group with Israel. But after the 1973 war, Anwar al-Sadat, he had a different vision for the region, and he kicked out the Soviet Union from his country, and he allowed the Americans to come in and project their power over the region, and hence he also struck the deal with Israel in 1978, and then the Jordanians joined the wagon of peace between brackets, and in Lebanon nowadays. Were it not for Hezbollah, I would say Lebanon would also strike a deal with Israel. So Syria left alone. In 1973, when the war erupted, at least the Saudis, they minimized or stopped the flow of oil. to the Western countries in order to increase the prices and also to punish the Americans for giving an air bridge to Israel. Now, if the Syrians, the best case scenario for Syria, if there is a war between Syria and Israel, is that the Arabic countries won't fund Israel against Syria. That's the best case scenario, right? Otherwise, Syria is left alone in this. And I don't think the balance of power is in favor of Syria. And it's people ask why Syria isn't retaliating against Israel directly. I mean, Syria undergone 12 years of war. Half of its military is destroyed. The air defense capabilities are destroyed. And Syria is a rational actor. People, of course, in the mainstream media, they try to portray Assad as if he's a monster, wakes up in the morning, he just puts his finger on the map and he decides to kill his own people. But it's not like that. Syria is a very rational actor, and they don't destabilize the region, and they don't initiate in such aggressions on their neighboring countries.
Yeah, in fact, they used to cooperate with the U.S. They provided the U.S. with intelligence after the Iraq War, and they even held on to prisoners and subjected them to torture, like Maher Arar. So there was an effort actually by Syria to cooperate, but the U.S. instead rewarded Syria with one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, regime change wars in history. Hekmat, you just came back from Syria and you wrote a report for the Gray Zone about it. It's called Immiserated, Humiliated, Yet Resilient: How Syrians Survive America's Economic Siege. Syria, of course, is subjected to the harshest U.S. sanctions in the world. Talk to us about what you found when you went and where you visited.
Yeah, so in general, I found, as I said, immiseration, a lot of desperation. But what I fundamentally found is that the Syrian people have realized that they are a cog in the game, but at the end of the game, they are playing for the long run. So they know that they're on the right side. They know that they have to just suffer through, and that things will start to change in the region slowly. I visited Tartous, Lattakia, Homs, and Aleppo. And throughout these major cities that once were booming hubs of industry, booming hubs of proletariat, side-by-side folks living different, not proletariat, but pluralitarian life of different religions, different ethnicities, people living side-by-side. Now they've been diminished to shells of what they used to look like. The cities of Aleppo are covered in soot of what are now privatized form of electricity, because the government can only afford to supply its citizens with 4 hours of electricity per day. So they're covered in soot from these ampere generator units around the city for each neighborhood. People have to rely on government-provided smart card registries in order to get their basic needs, get their basic food, their basic rations for gas, to get their cars moving, to go to work. And immiseration, the currency I mentioned in the report, has devalued incredibly, especially since the launch of the HR 31 Caesar bill against the Syrian people in 2019. The Syrian pound now has been devalued to almost 9,000 Syrian pounds per dollar. Kevork and I remember a time when the Syrian pound exchanged for 40 Syrian pounds exchanged for $1. So you can imagine how devastating that has become on the savings, on the livelihoods of everyday Syrians who used to have a dignified life up until this war in 2011. So a lot of devastation. But at the end of the day, I conclude the article with showcasing some aspects of cultural life, how it's slowly regenerating, how there are cultural performances happening in the citadel of Aleppo, how churches are now vibrant hosts for classical music that's being attended by standing room only audiences. And I mean, you can't deny that there's a sense of hope in the country, but still, I mean, you have 90% of the population under the poverty line. I don't know how much hope that can sustain the everyday Syrian. So it's, read the article and see for yourself what the policies that are being enacted in your name as an American are doing to another population across the world.
Actually, it's an act of sadism. Aaron said this multiple times by the American and successive administrations when they failed in their foreign policy approach in Syria or goals, and now they're strangling the Syrian people for resisting against this project. And to be honest with you guys, before the Caesar Act, the people were able to see the enemy, and they can identify the enemy. There are actual tens of thousands of terrorists underground, and they can see there are military hostilities between the Syrian army and these terrorists. So you, psychologically speaking, you can blame the terrorists for what is happening. And since 2000, starting from 2008 till today, because the hostilities are on the minimum level, let's say, between the army and the terrorists, people cannot see the enemy anymore. It's an invisible enemy, and these sanctions are harming the major supplies of Syria, the Syrian government that has to provide to the people. Lots of people do not know that 70% of the fuel in Syria now comes from Iran. And Iran has to do very long turn to come to Syria from the Mediterranean and all the way from the African Horn sometimes. And Israel, they detonate. They have detonated several Iranian tankers, and the Brits and the Americans, they hijacked several Iranian tankers. So it's like they want the people to die in Syria so that the people rise against the government. And I would say, yes, Assad's popularity has become a little bit less after 2018 because, as I mentioned, people want solutions. And in Syria, as much as you strangle the economy and you try to slowly kill the people, this will give opportunity to the corrupted people to use this opportunity in order for them to provide, for example, electricity. Who is providing now in the black market to the people? Those are mafias, in my opinion. So the sanctions on Syria, and for example, the drug production now in Syria. Why is this phenomenon happening in Syria after 2017 and 2018? Because when you weaken the central government and you weaken its capability to provide to its people, non-state actors will thrive in the country. And this is mostly coming from warlords, and they have made lots of fortunes in Syria, and they are exploiting this situation. So I would say sanctions on Syria are exaggerating they are increasing the level of corruption in Syria, not the other way around, as the Americans claim in this regard.
And speaking of Israel's role, we actually have some footage that you included in your article, Hekmat. If we could just take a look at that.
So 2 weeks after the earthquake, you gotta keep in mind that the earthquake had wrecked Aleppo, the most populous city in northern Syria, and had destroyed a lot of infrastructure in Lattakia, in the governorate of Aleppo, and killed 5,000 people within Syria, much more than 5,000. Israel strikes deep within Syria, and you have to understand that they say that they target military forces or military installations, but in reality they're bombing civilian neighborhoods. And they have done about 400 sorties in the last 2 years, and as a result, in the last year, Syria has suffered about 50 casualties. And I will talk further about the Syrian army casualties and my own experience with one of them who lost comrades in one of the strikes.
And so this is a video that was posted by Dimitri Laskaris, who's a lawyer. And it's, as you said, it's 2 weeks after the earthquake happened. And this is what it looks like after Israel launched strikes on civilian areas of Damascus that killed at least 15 people, including 2 women. And this actual image, this site that we're going to see in this video, is the citadel in the old city of Damascus, a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Archaeology, and I remember that when I was a student, I come to that office كان بروفيسور اسمه علي ياغي يمكن now
it's so weird to see that video because it's this beautiful UNESCO site and it's this weird juxtaposition of a beautiful site and then wreckage.
Yeah, so Israel has struck almost 300 times within Syria for the last 2 years, and they claim that they target only military installations for Iran and Hezbollah, but in reality, they're targeting Syrian Arab Army soldiers, and they're targeting civilians. In this tweet that I shared, 15 people died, 2 of them women, many of them civilian, and the thing that astounds the everyday Syrian is something that I experienced as I was having a conversation with a Syrian Arab Army, a veteran, when I was taking a bus from Homs to Aleppo during my trip. He explained to me that he lost a lot of his comrades fighting the scum of the earth, the ISIS, the Al-Qaeda affiliates in Syria, and ridding the world of these jihadist fundamentalists. But the loss that hurt him the most and just grieved him the most is a loss of one of his comrades in Israeli strike, because he realized that these strikes are sanctioned by the Western world. These strikes are sanctioned by this world that the Syrian army has defended, because the Syrian army made sure that these scum of the earth that came into Syria and fought and murdered and raped and ate hearts within the governorates of Syria stayed in Syria and died in Syria. So they made sure that they did not go back to Paris, they did not go back to Berlin, they did not go back to Washington and London. But now this is how these Western capitals are repaying the Syrian Arab army. They're repaying them by killing more of them with Western sanctioned Israeli strikes in the pretext of fighting against Iranian militias.
At the beginning of the war, I remember in the first few weeks, these so-called rebel groups, they attacked several military installations in the suburbs of Damascus. They were mostly air defense systems. They destroyed them completely. And several Syrian military scientists and engineers were assassinated in Damascus while they were walking out of their home. These are all, in my opinion, targeted attacks, and they are clear Israeli fingerprints on them. But after the regime change war failed, Israel accelerated its bombing of Syria, because Syria is trying to bring advanced air defense systems. Russia isn't interested in giving Syria the advanced air defense systems or operating them, because they want to keep a balanced relationship with Israel. So it's Iran who is supplying advanced air defense systems now to Syria. But in order to the air defense system, when you bring it to Syria, you have to network it with your old or Russian air defense systems. You have to train them, and afterwards you can use them, right? And Israel, every time Syria receives let's say a shipment of air defense systems, they try to destroy them before they are installed in their places, and in the course of it, they kill Syrian army officers. And now, if you count the number of military personnel, let's say, who died by Israeli attacks, the numbers are definitely, if it's 10, 9 of them are Syrian army officers, and 1 of them probably from Hezbollah or Iran. But we have to know something very important. Iran doesn't have a combat force in Syria. They don't have a fighting force. They have advisors, and they have trainers in Syria, and they are there to advise the Syrian army on combating terrorism, but at the same time training them on this weaponry. And Israel doesn't want Syria to have this type of weaponry, and that's why they're striking in Syria, but also they're striking in residential areas, because in their perception, they think they are above a law, every law, of course, in the world, and they can just assassinate anyone they want. And sometimes with false intelligence information. Sometimes they think that they're targeting someone who they think is important, and they have a legitimacy to assassinate them somehow. and then they bomb an entire building, and 10 civilians die in, for example, and with complete disregard of the casualties or the collateral damage that can cause in this regard. And I want to make a comparison. For example, imagine when you go to the media after every Israeli bombing, they say, "Oh, the Israel is attacking Iranian affiliate groups or attacking military shipments, etc., etc." Okay, let's reverse this example and say, what if Syria starts bombing every military shipment that is coming to Israel, to the Haifa port? What if Syria starts assassinating the CIA trainers or the Pentagon trainers that are with hundreds in Israel, right? Like, does it really make any sense? Why Israel has the right to have its defensive weaponry, but Syria doesn't have that right? And the media is very complicit in this, and the reporting on Syria is very biased, and in a way that I feel sick in my stomach when I read the reporting of the mainstream media on Syria, because there are few things. It's not only biased, but also dehumanizing. Syrians are not humans in their eyes, and especially if you live in government held area. If you die in an earthquake, 5,000 people die, it's nothing for them because they live in an Assad held areas. And if there are international organizations want to bring aid and relief aid to these areas, then they lobby against it, because they say, what do they say? They say Assad is going to steal the aid. I mean, this is so ridiculous on so many levels. Imagine that Assad is stealing a few cargoes of humanitarian aid. What is he going to do? Feed his son, his daughter? What is he going to do with a few cargoes of humanitarian aid? Is he going to consolidate his regime with humanitarian aid? So the journalists, the so-called experts on Syria, are also, they have blood on their hands, and they're like a parallel intelligence apparatus, giving all sorts of justifications and information to the intelligence apparatuses, so that these criminal, I would say, psychopaths in Washington and elsewhere around the world would continue in their policy. And I will not hesitate to name some of them, but I'm not going to do that now on this show. But there are at least 10 to 20 so-called experts on Syria. Their entire role is to give justification for the U.S. first regime change war, and secondly the sanctions on Syria. These people they have made a career out of Syria. Therefore, now when Syria goes back to the Arab League and we see that some winds of peace is finally hitting the region, and they go hysterical, and you can see them on Twitter and other social media platforms. And if they are publishing one article per month, they're now publishing every week, because they have to lobby. These people are lobbyists, and they work hand in hand with intelligence apparatuses. And I mean, how is it possible for an expert on Syria to be exclusively picked, invited by the U.S. occupation forces to come and pay a visit to the areas that are occupied by the U.S. occupation forces in Syria? What are the odds that this person is not linked to the intelligence apparatuses in the West? So these people are, in my opinion, if in any fair word, they would be behind bars. And they have caused lots of damage and inflicted lots of pain upon the Syrian people. And we will never forget that. I mean, we're Syrians. We've seen what happened on the ground in Syria, and we know who said what and who convinced who in the United States to continue. And now we have this new act that it is against the normalization of relations with the Assad regime, and they criminalize the Washington to normalize relations with the Washington with Syria. I would say when Assad visited Moscow, this was a few weeks ago, he heard in Moscow very clearly that Syria shouldn't work on convincing the West to lift the sanctions. They're not going to do that anytime soon. So we have to bet on a change in the international system, especially through the gate of Ukraine. And when there is a parallel monetary system in parallel to dollar, and if the de-dollarization works, then all the sanctions of the United States will be toothless. So that is what in Syria they are betting on. but also now the support of the Gulf countries to reconstruct the country. I mean, does the United States really, are they going to really sanction Saudi Arabia? Are they really going to sanction the Emirates? Are they really going to cause an energy crisis in the world? No, they're not going to do that. If Saudi Arabia and Emirates want to invest in Syria, they're going to invest in Syria regardless of the American objection.
Yeah, the Syrians are betting on the ruble, they're betting on the yen. And as you mentioned, Kevork, I'm sure you were talking about Charles Lister from the Middle East Institute. But there's also hope there because his funding comes directly from the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates, the Saudi Aramco Services Company, and Lockheed Martin Corporation. So some funding will stay, but the overwhelming majority of the funding that was primarily coming from the GCC I'm sure will change in the future, especially with this opening up of relations and normalization in the region. So I'm hoping that Charles Lister will be out of a job soon.
Yeah, he will become soon an expert on Taiwan and an expert on Ukraine. He will find something. Don't worry, these people can recycle themselves everywhere.
Like cockroaches surviving a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah,
exactly.
Can you guys talk about your own relationship to Syria, your personal journeys, like the last time you were there, where you're based, what brought you to where you're based?
Yeah, I can start. So Kevork and I share the same city. I grew up in Aleppo, the same city Kevork came from. And I grew up in Aleppo until 2014 when the war was at its climax and the siege of Aleppo started. And we essentially, at that point, we decided that we can't take it anymore. We have lost most of our savings as a family. And we decided to take a risk. We smuggled ourselves with our dog and cat out of the Syrian-held territories. We passed a free Syrian army roadblock, and we essentially got out. And we eventually got to the States where my father had a work visa. And and ever since, now I live in France, but I keep going back to Syria. I have a lot of friends and family in Aleppo and Homs and Damascus, and I have hopes for the future of the country.